So hello and welcome. You are interested in amateur microscopy, you would like to buy yourself a microscope and you don't know which one. So you Google around a little bit, you check Amazon, maybe you check eBay or other online shops, you discover a microscope that you like, you want to check if it's a good one, so you post a question in a forum. And then you're overwhelmed with a whole bunch of messages from other people that tell you why the microscope is not good or why it is good, and there's a big debate and you're left more confused than you actually started off with. So and the point of this video tutorial is to clarify a few points and to make a little bit microscope choice a little bit easier. Because I think there are not a lot of options anyway, and most microscopes actually share all of the features that you need as an amateur microscopist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step you through now the most important criteria so that you can start to select the way. And I have to be very honest with you, especially with microscopes, a lot is a question of taste. And the best microscope, well, that's the one that you're going to use most often and the one that you personally like a lot. That's the best microscope. Okay, but I'm going to start off anyway in a more objective way. Haha, no pun intended. And I'm going to tell you some of the important points here. So let's start off. I actually prepared a little board here. The single most important criterion is does the microscope adhere to the 160 millimeter DIN standard. If it does not adhere to this standard, then it's disqualified right from the beginning. Okay, this is a very common standard, and this means that the objectives of all these microscopes that have this standard are interchangeable. Now there is also a somewhat more rare 170 millimeter standard that's also okay, but this one is definitely much more common. Some microscopes also have so-called infinity objectives. That's again a different standard, and I would say if you get yourself a microscope with infinity objectives, well then you're definitely on the safe side, because these are very high-end microscopes. But anything which does not at least have 160 millimeter DIN standard I reject out of hand, because all microscopes that have this standard have at least a minimum quality. And now I'm going to explain you a little bit how this actually works, and what I have over here is you got to get yourself an objective, and if you read the numbers over here you can see that there's a small 160 written on there, and this actually indicates that it adheres to this standard. So that is basically the so-called I would say the single most important criterion. Okay, now concerning the objectives themselves, okay, I'm just going to use this educational microscope here as an example. Concerning these objectives themselves, which ones should you get? Okay, and also here I have a certain recommendation, and I've already filled it out on the other side over here. Get yourself objectives with a 4x, 10x and 40x magnification. That is the minimum, sometimes they come with also a 100x oil immersion objective. Many microscopes are equipped with those when you want to buy it. My advice is honestly, if you want to save yourself some money, don't get this one because it's actually a relatively specialized objective. But get yourself try to and ask the company if you can get a 60x objective, a so-called a dry objective. The others are also dry objectives. This means that basically they're just the use is the same, because the 100x oil immersion objective means that you have to put some immersion oil directly on the slide. It's just going to show you here the slide. And you got to put oil directly on the slide, and then you have to rotate the objective into the oil. So that means it's covered in oil. This is to prevent air from being between the objective and the slide. And this can only be done with the so-called oil immersion objective. They're very expensive. They give you a lot of magnification, of course, but the application is rather specialized. So I would say unless you really want to experiment around with that, I would probably say it's probably I'd rather invest my money into different things than into an oil immersion objective. Okay, I just wanted to make this clear. So 4x, 10x, 40x. My microscope over here, the big one, that I have also has a 20x objective and a 60x objective as well. Okay, so my advice would be, when you buy yourself a microscope, I'd rather look how many objectives can you actually mount at the same time. The very low-end microscopes allow you to mount only 3 objectives. This one over here allows you to mount 1. How many? I cannot even see this myself. Right, 4 objectives are over here. The big one over here you can connect 5 objectives. So this is actually one of the criteria that determines a price difference between the microscopes. Okay, so concerning the objectives now, there are also different types of, how shall I say, techniques. And the common one is so-called bright field microscopy, and this means that these objectives are intended to be the light is shining from the bottom, and those structures that are dark will appear dark. That's obvious, right? However, there's also so-called more expensive phase contrast objectives, which are there to actually increase the contrast of transparent specimens. So they convert transparent specimens into different degrees of darkness and brightness. That's complex physics is behind that, and those objectives are extremely expensive, and they really push up the price. So generally, for amateur microscopists, we all start off with a regular bright field, so-called achromatic objectives. The achromatic means that there is a color correction to it to prevent chromatic aberration, and these achromatic objectives are cheaper than the so-called apochromatic objectives. And those apochromatic objectives I would not buy, because you don't benefit from them, because they might be very good. Obviously they are good. They are significantly more expensive, mostly used for photographic work if you want to take high quality pictures. But if your specimen slide is not of sufficient quality, it's also not going to benefit you. Okay, so get yourself achromatic bright field objectives, which are over here. Generally, it is like this, that the microscopes already come with, low-cost microscopes already come with these, because there is no point to have the more expensive objectives anyway. So the next feature that I definitely would recommend is the so-called mechanical stage. The mechanical stage. The stage is this part over here where you put the slide. Okay, and a mechanical stage has 2 knobs here on the side. I'm gonna lift this. Okay, and by turning this, you can move the slide into one dimension and also into the other dimension. Okay, and this helps you to position the slide in very low-cost microscopes and field microscopes, and also many years ago they had these so-called stage clips, okay, which were just holding the slide in place, and then you had to use your fingers to move the slide around. And this is actually not so good, because you're exerting pressure on the stage this way, and this way you're losing the focus, because you're focusing by changing the position of the stage. Okay, so mechanical stage is a definite must, I would say, to have, unless there's a good reason for you not to have it. Very low end microscopes don't have it. Okay, so that is pretty much straightforward. Pretty much all decent microscopes these days in the educational use have it. Some very low cost field microscopes might not. The condenser, another feature which you definitely should look out for. Also, every decent microscope has this one, okay, except toy microscopes. What does the condenser do, or where can it be found? First of all, the condenser is an optical element that can be found beneath the stage, and there's a lever here to change the opening and closing of a diaphragm. And this one is important for regulating depth of field and contrast. And because if your microscope has a condenser, then there is also a so-called swing out filter holder. I don't know if you can see this now. Okay, you can put filters in there, and these filters allow you then to try out different imaging techniques, like for example dark field and so on. So this condenser not only improves image quality, but also allows you to experiment around with different depth of field, contrast. It's for adjustment if you want to take pictures and all these things. So that's definitely a feature to look out for. Again, most educational microscopes and low-end microscopes these days already have this. So the next one, coarse and fine focus knobs. You might wonder, why am I even mentioning this? Because I've seen some low-end microscopes that only have one focus knob and not both of them. And for me that would be also one of those knockout criteria, a microscope with only one focus knob, unless it is a stereo microscope. Okay, they work differently. But for the compound microscopes, if there's only one focus knob, I would disregard it. Okay, so what do I mean? Over here, this one is the coarse focus knob, the one over here on the outside to turn, and the one here is the fine focus knob, which raises and lowers the stage in very small increments, and this one in large increments. Yeah, again, why am I mentioning this? Every decent compound microscope should have it. Some don't. Okay, some very rare ones don't. So look out that you don't accidentally buy one that does not have both of them. A light intensity regulator. What is that? Well, microscopes can not only be switched on and off, but you can also adjust the brightness of the lamp. And in this case, in this microscope, you can turn a wheel over here. The main switch is on the back. Okay, but then the brightness can be regulated over here. This Olympus microscope over there has a main switch over here and a knob that you can turn to increase or decrease the brightness. This is also, I think, very important to have. I know that some very low-end microscopes or toy microscopes don't have this, so this should also be present. But yes, I'm just mentioning this for the sake of completion, because I think every decent microscope should have this. When you're going microscope shopping, you're actually going to find out very quickly that the majority of microscopes actually have these features that I talked about right now. So what is the difference between the microscopes? And to give you a concrete example, both of these microscopes over here, they have all of these features that I just mentioned. And this one over here was around 200 euros, and this one over here was around 3,000 euros, so more than 10 times the price. So what's the difference? Now, if you look through the microscope, you'll be probably surprised the image quality is not that much different. The reason is because the image quality is determined by the objective and the eyepiece. And yeah, that's essentially it. And if I exchange the objectives and eyepieces, I get the same image quality. So what is the difference right now? Well, yes, there is some microscopes are, how shall I say, manufactured a little bit better. There is less wiggling going around in the parts, the tolerances are smaller, the engineering is slightly better. But this has not always, or in only very few cases, actually an impact on the image quality. Obviously, the big one microscope over here has a so-called trinocular head. I mean, you can now use both eyes to look through it. You get the same image. You don't see stereoscopically, but it's simply more convenient because you don't have to close your eye all the time. And then there's a photo tube attached over here so that you can mount a camera. Okay, that's one difference. It's a great deal bigger. Obviously, it's heavier and more stable. Otherwise, all of the features are pretty much the same. I mean, this one also has an additional Köhler illumination, so that means, this was my filter, okay? So basically, there's an additional diaphragm down here, but otherwise, from the overall design, there's not a huge difference. So what is it now? Well, it is like this, that there is, as always, there is this so-called 80-20 rule. So this means you can... For significantly more money, you're gaining a little bit more. So if you want to have the last 20% of performance out of that, you're paying significantly more. Okay, so that is a little bit like this. I mean, it's like this, that with this one over here, you're not going to see 10 times more than with the small one over here. Okay, but sometimes there are a few features that simply are indispensable for some people. For example, for me, I like to take a lot of pictures through the microscope. Okay, so I want to have a really good photo tube. I know it's difficult for you to see now because it's a little bit off of the screen, but for me this was a really important criterion, and this costs a lot of money. Now, it does not mean that you're not able to take pictures with this. You can remove the eyepiece, you can attach a camera here. Of course you can do that, but I want to be able to take pictures and at the same time look through the microscope. Okay, so that's, you see, there are certain features that I simply do not want to, how shall I say, dispense of, and therefore, yeah, for me that was worth the money. But this does not automatically mean that this is something that everyone needs. In many web forums, when people want to go microscope shopping and ask, well, they're always asking, well, is this brand good? Is this a good or a bad brand? And that is, I have to admit, that's also a little bit a difficult thing, because it depends a lot, not on the brand itself, but actually on the specific microscope, because a certain brand can manufacture relatively low-cost microscopes, and they can also manufacture or sell very high-end microscopes. So it depends very much on the individual microscope. My personal advice would be, especially for beginners, or if you're just starting to get into the hobby, is get yourself a reasonably low-cost microscope, like, I don't know, a €200 or $200 microscope, and get started with that. And if the hobby hooks you, and if you like the hobby, you can always invest more money later on. That is my general advice. You have to learn a little bit, actually hands-on. And if you now invest, I don't know, right away a €3,000 microscope, and you're not happy with it for whatever reasons, because it's too big, too bulky, or you don't inconvenient, or you just don't like using it, then what's the point? So my advice is get yourself a cheap one, a low cost, not the cheapest, not toy microscopes, okay, but a decent low-end microscope costs you around 200 to 300 euros maybe, and then get started with that. And then later on you can always upgrade, and then you know actually what you look out for, and you can also then make a more informed decision later on. Okay. Now, if you if you not go shopping, but if you post questions on web forums, then many people are going to say, well, don't buy those cheap microscopes. It's better to buy yourself a used quality brand name microscope compared to a no-name microscope. I get the point. They're saying, well, for the same price, you're getting a lot more value, resale value. I get the point, but I think for beginners this might be risky, because you don't know what you're buying unless you have a microscope shop that can ensure that the used microscope is working well, and everything is fine. I did not have no problems, definitely not. But if essentially you're buying simply an unknown. We say how do we say it? We buy a cat in a sack or something like that. There's this idiom, and you don't essentially know what you're buying. Then that might be also problematic. Okay, so my advice would be is probably buy yourself from a microscope dealer a new microscope, one that where you know it's gonna work, and they might also take it back maybe after some time if you make a certain agreement. Okay. If you're not happy with it, and you can maybe upgrade or something. So that would be my personal advice here. Otherwise, there is a lot of, how shall I say, personal preference involved. Okay, and the best microscope is the one that you're actually going to be using most of the time. Okay, so my advice is make a decision also based on emotions. I mean, honestly, it's a hobby, right? And it's more than simply getting a great image quality or getting the highest value for your money or whatever. It's a personal thing, and for me, this microscope over here, for significantly less money, I could have gotten myself a microscope with the same image quality. But I bought this microscope over there when I finished my university studies, and I wanted it to be expensive, and I wanted it to be good, and I wanted to spend money. I'll be honest with you, okay? Because I said, okay, that is the present I'm making myself, and I've saved for many years for a top microscope, and that's what I bought, and I still have it now, and it's really it's new basically, even though it's already 20 years old. Okay, so there's a lot of this emotional factor is very important as well. Okay, and if you start asking around now concerning different brand names and different, I don't know, then it's getting very much in a debate that I do not think is very fruitful all the time. Just get yourself a microscope, get started with the hobby. After all, it is a tool because it's there for nature observation. We like to observe nature. We want to explore their environment. That's actually the main thing. And so the focus actually should not be so much on the technical device itself. I know it is. I also like the technical aspect of microscopes. Okay, I'll be honest with you. But it's also part of the hobby for me. But yeah, but let's not forget about observing, and yeah, don't forget, in the past, great discoveries have been made with microscopes that were far below even the lowest, the cheapest microscopes that we have right now. Okay, so great discoveries have been made with very, very low-end microscopes according to our modern standards, of course. One should never forget that. Okay, well, that was basically a little bit of philosophy right now at the end. I hope it was a little bit informative, and I wish you a nice day as always, and all the best.